To begin today, we have the honor of hearing from retired U.S. Army General Lloyd Milo Miles. He is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. General Miles commanded at every level, from captain to major general, and he led a combat team in Iraq and one of the earliest peacekeeping missions in the Sinai. General Miles retired in 2012 after more than 32 years of active duty, and he joined the University of Maryland University College in 2015. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor. Please join me in welcoming University of Maryland University College Senior Vice President for Global Military Operations, General Milo Miles.
Thank you, Rich. I also want to thank the leaders that are here today, and also thank the members of the chamber who allowed us to speak here today, and also to Phil Zachary and the Entercom team for being wonderful partners over the last couple of years. I've never spoken to a group like this at a chamber, so this is really a first for me, and it reminded me of an old story that I heard from a pastor friend of mine who said that the very first time he spoke at a church down in Montgomery, Alabama, he delivered his message and stood at the very back of the church and then shook hands with the parishioners as they were leaving. And everything seemed to be going pretty well until an elderly woman by the name of Mrs. Jackson came walking up. She was kind of hard of hearing, and she grabbed the pastor's hand, and she said, "That was the worst message I have ever heard." And then she moved on. And needless to say, the pastor was a little bit taken aback by this, but, he went home and he thought about it, and he thought, okay, it wasn't my best work. It wasn't the worst, but it wasn't my best work, and maybe Mrs. Jackson had a point, and maybe next Sunday, I'm really going to prepare, and next Sunday, I'm gonna knock it out of the park. So he prayed and practiced and prayed some more. Next Sunday came, he delivered his message, stood in the back, shook the hands as they were leaving, and kept his eye out for Mrs. Jackson. And sure enough, here she came. She came shuffling up. She grabbed the pastor's hand, and this time she said, "The message was better, but the delivery was terrible." And then she moved on. Well, needless to say, the pastor was a little bit not only embarrassed, but a little bit hurt by that. And one of the other parishioners could see that and came walking up to the pastor and said, "Now, don't worry about Mrs. Jackson, Pastor. She just repeats what other people say." So I'm going to make a deal with you this morning. I won't preach at you if you promise when I'm done not to repeat what other people say. Look, when I was asked if I would speak at this event, my first question was, well, what do you want me to talk about? And the response I got was, well, say something about veterans. That's kind of a broad topic, but, to an old soldier, when you leave it broad, that just gives us permission to tell war stories. So I decided I would focus my comments really on the early part of my career and talk about 3 veterans that I knew during that time period in my life. The first one I want to talk to you about was my father. My father was also a veteran. He served 32 years in the military as well. And he was a man that did not want to join the military, didn't really want to have anything to do with it, but he was drafted like a lot of young men in his generation at the tail end of the Second World War. Now, he ended up being sent on occupation duty after the war, where he met my mother in Japan. He would spend several years there, and then he would get sent to the Canal Zone in Panama. There he would stay in the Canal Zone until the Korean War broke out. He would be wounded in Korea. And by the time he fully recovered, he had about 10 years in the military, so he had a decision to make. Do I stay in, and for another 10 years, take advantage of the retirement benefits, or go ahead and get on out and get on with my life? Well, over the years, he kind of found out that he kind of liked the military, so he decided to stay. Well, about the 20-year mark, the Vietnam War was just getting started. So he had another decision point to make. He could just get on out because he had put in his 20, or he could go on this war that everybody thought was going to be short and then come back and leave at that point. Well, 3 tours and 10 years later, including being wounded on his second tour in Vietnam, my father's service in the military came to an end. During that time, as I was a kid growing up, I loved hearing the stories that my father would tell my mother whenever he came back home from work about his day, and most of the time it would always come back around to what some second lieutenant had done that day, and really what some second lieutenant had done wrong that day. In fact, my father was fond of saying that the 3 things he hated most while serving in the military were cold coffee, wet toilet paper, and second lieutenants. Now, as a young kid, I didn't know anything about rank. That may be true for many of you, but I just assumed at that time that second lieutenants had to be the very lowest rank in the military, You know, I know it's the private today, but at that time I figured it had to be second lieutenants, and I sure didn't want to be one of them someday. You know, my father, when I went to the military academy, he retired while I was a cadet at the academy, and he would often tell his drinking buddies down at the VFW that the reason why he got out of the military is because he didn't want to have to salute his second lieutenant's son when I was commissioned out of the academy. The truth of the matter was, obviously, his service years were actually over. West Point has this wonderful tradition that on the day that we're commissioned, which is also graduation day, each of us carries a silver dollar coin in our pocket. And the tradition has it that the very first enlisted man who salutes you in uniform on that day, you present them with a silver dollar coin. Well, for me, the very first person to salute me in uniform was retired Command Sergeant Major Miles. He would say that that was one of the most proudest days of his life, and I think it was for me too. From my father, I learned duty and discipline and love of country. My second story I want to tell you about also occurred in my early years as a lieutenant. The very first duty station I was assigned to was Fort Carson, Colorado. I was assigned as a combat infantry platoon leader of 37 men. Now, in that group of 37 men, about a third of them were non-commissioned officers. The non-commissioned officers, or NCOs, are the very senior, experienced individuals within the unit. They had between 5 and 20 years of service. The junior enlisted troops had between 1 and 4. But no matter how you sliced it, all of them had more experience than some young second lieutenant coming right out of college. In fact, the non-commissioned officers would often say that they had more time in the chow line or in the latrine than lieutenants had on the face of the earth. And in some cases, it was actually true. So you can imagine the incredible pressure put on a young lieutenant assuming command of a unit for the very first time. But nonetheless, I was still eager. I wanted to get out there in the field and show my troops that I knew what I was doing. You know, one of the things that they hammered into us back at the academy and back at the basic course for officers before we would go to our first unit is that they would teach us how to emplace the machine guns. The machine guns were the most critical weapon for that infantry platoon. So they drilled us on it, they hammered us about it, so I felt pretty confident that when I got to my first unit, I could do that task. Well, soon enough, I would get my chance, and the very first field exercise that we actually had, my platoon would pull into a defensive perimeter, and I chose a position roughly in the center with my platoon sergeant, Sergeant First Class Gary Smith, and my radio operator. Once I dropped my rucksack, I told my platoon sergeant, I'm going to go in and place the machine guns. His response was, hey, sir, Staff Sergeant Inman, who at that time was my assistant platoon sergeant, said, Staff Sergeant Inman's got it. Well, I remember what they had taught me back at school, so I said, well, I'm still going to go and place the guns, and his response was, sir, Sergeant Inman's got it. And I said, I got this, platoon sergeant. And his response was, all right, sir. Whenever somebody gives you a response like that, you know it's probably not a good thing. But anyway, I did my thing. I'm an eager young lieutenant. I go find the machine guns. I find a position that I think is a good place for them. I'm looking down behind the guns like this, and I can see out about 600 meters. So I figured that's a pretty good position, right? If some enemy target popped up at that distance, the machine gunner would be able to engage it. I head back to the middle of the platoon CP. Right before I could sit down, I hear a non-commissioned officer, it happens to be Sergeant Inman, the assistant platoon sergeant. He is yelling at the top of his voice at the machine gun crews. It's a two-man crew. And he is saying, who put the blankety-blank machine guns in this blankety-blank position? And the young troops on the gun, of course, they threw me under the bus immediately and said, Lieutenant Miles did, Sergeant. Anyway, so I go over there, and sure enough, I asked, well, what's the problem? And the assistant platoon sergeant said, sir, did you put the guns here? And I said, yes, I did, and you can see out about 600 meters, so it's a pretty good position. He said, sir, did you get down on the ground behind the guns? Now, they didn't teach us that piece about emplacing the weapons at the academy. He said, and he could tell from the look on my face and the pause that I had there, he said, sir, get on down behind the gun. So when you lay down on your belly behind the gun, just like a machine gunner would, you clearly could see right away that a gunner would only be able to see out about 50 meters because the terrain rose ever so slightly that he wouldn't be able to see anything beyond that position. So, needless to say, I was a little embarrassed, but I learned a valuable lesson that day. I went back to my platoon CP, and my platoon sergeant, Sergeant Smith, was kind of chuckling a little bit, and he said, sir, let me give you some advice. Don't let your education get in the way of your learning. Don't let your education get in the way of your learning. That's a piece of advice that stuck with me for the rest of my life, including this current job. You You see, our folks, just like troops, they don't care what hangs on your wall. What they care about is what hangs on your heart. And they want to know, do you care about them? Because folks don't care what you know unless they know that you care. And so that was a lesson that I took from that experience. From Sergeant First Class Gary Smith, I learned discipline. I also learned the value of hard preparation, and I also learned the value of experience. The last little vignette or story I want to tell you about also occurred in the very early years. Once I left the military academy, they sent all infantry officers down to Fort Benning, Georgia, home of the infantry. And so they would put us through a 16-week course there, and from that, then we would show up to our first duty station. Well, the very first day, we did physical training, or PT, in the morning, and then, they marched us to the mess hall. I think it's called dining facility today. And, we would go through the line, and you would just point to the different things that you wanted, and an attendant behind the counter would just plop it onto your plate. So I like hot cereal, like cream of wheat. So as I'm going through the line, I see something that looks like cream of wheat. Now, it was the same color. The texture was a little bit rougher, but I kind of figured that, this is the Army, so you can't expect it to be like your mom prepares it. So I asked for some of that. The attendant plopped it on my plate. I went on through. I sat down across from another new lieutenant that was from Atlanta, Georgia, named Steve Reynolds. Now, we exchanged some pleasantries right up front, and then we got down to business. I figured I would eat the cream of wheat first because, it was still warm. So I grabbed the sugar dispenser, and I was getting ready to put some sugar on my cream of wheat. And Steve Reynolds says in a very direct voice, "What are you doing?" And I responded in a calm but somewhat annoyed voice, "I'm putting some sugar on my cream of wheat." And he responded, "That's not cream of wheat, them's grits." Now, I grew up in Colorado, and I have to admit I had never seen or tasted grits before, but I could tell that was a pretty emotional event for Steve Reynolds. Long story short, Steve Reynolds and I actually became pretty good friends, actually fast friends. And I would often say or joke that he befriended me because he probably thought that any man that didn't know the difference between cream of wheat and grits probably was not going to make it in the Army. The real reason is that Steve and I both discovered along the way that we had this lifelong dream that we shared, and that was to go to the top of Machu Picchu, the lost city of the Incas high in the Andes Mountains. And so we would talk about it all the time during our breaks. We would share pictures about it and look at National Geographic, et cetera. And in typical lieutenant fashion, we decided that during the break in that 16-week course that we were going to go to Machu Picchu. So we made all the plans, and everything seemed to be lined up pretty good until the day before we were supposed to actually go. We were told by our military leaders that the trip was disapproved. At that time, the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path guerrillas, were very active in Peru, and therefore our trip was denied. Needless to say, we were very disappointed, in fact, heartbroken. But we made a promise to each other that we would get to the top of Machu Picchu, and if we couldn't do it together, then whoever went to the top would have to drink a cup of joe or a cup of coffee to the other person. Well, as fate would have it, about a year after we graduated from the basic course, Steve Reynolds was killed in a parachute accident during an airborne operation. Several years later, I would be seriously injured by a grenade and would spend a year in Walter Reed Army Medical Center as an inpatient. So things weren't looking too good for Team Cream of Wheat and Grits. But over the years, I never forgot about that promise I made to Steve Reynolds. And in 2006, I found myself in Latin America traveling on military business, and one of the stops was going to take me through to Peru. And so I knew at that time that if I didn't go to the top of Machu Picchu then, I probably never would, because of the age and wear and tear on my body. So I remember telling my wife about it, and she said, she really wasn't a big fan, but she kind of understood. And so she had bought me a thermos to take on this trip. And after my military business was done, I flew on a plane to Cusco, spent overnight. Next morning, filled that thermos up with coffee, and then headed on a train, and then a train to a bus, and then from there you begin the hike to the top of the mountain. It was pretty difficult, but I finally made it to the top of that mountain, and I can remember standing there, and I took that thermos and poured that first cup into that lid, and then slowly poured it out onto the ground to Steve Reynolds, and then poured that second cup and slowly drank it, taking in the view on top of that mountain. And I think to this day it's probably the best cup of coffee that I've ever had. And that promise to Steve, stuck with me those years. And from Steve Reynolds, I learned the value of friendship. I learned the value of being able to laugh at yourself, and also the value of keeping your promises no matter what. You know, as a nation, we've got promises to keep too, you know, to our veterans. Back in Washington, D.C., on the Lincoln Memorial, and some of you have probably seen it, are words from his second inaugural address that's carved right there in the monument. It says, "To care for those who have borne the battle, and his widow, and his children." To care for those who shall have borne the battle, and his widow, and his children. President Lincoln wrote those words right at the tail end of the Civil War, and after the nation had seen the horrors of places like Gettysburg and Antietam. But those words are true today, just like they were back then. And so as a nation, we have promises to keep to those veterans. And so, you know, if you really want to thank a veteran, you know, the appreciation days are great and the discounts and those kinds of things, but the real way that you show your appreciation is to give them a job, is to hire them, because that's how it will make a difference. And don't look at your strategic plan, not from standing up behind the guns like I did, but getting down on the ground, where you might find that the terrain that hinders veterans is actually quite different from that perspective. I'll leave you this morning with a quotation from my favorite novel, Once an Eagle, and perhaps some of you have actually read it. But in that novel, the protagonist, Sam Damon, says that the whole challenge to life is to act with honor and hope and generosity, no matter what you've drawn. You can't help when or what you were born, and you may not be able to help when or how you die, but you can and should try to pass the days between as a good man. You're all good men and women. As you go about your days and your leadership tasks, remember Command Sergeant Major Miles and Sergeant First Class Smith and Second Lieutenant Steve Reynolds, and then go do something good for somebody else, because that's what it's all about. Thank you very much for attending this event, and thank you very much for listening to the ramblings of an old soldier. Thank you.